The Ocala Community Center buzzed with restless energy on that muggy March evening in 2025, the kind of night where the air stuck to your skin and the faint perfume of orange blossoms sneaked through cracked windows. Rows of folding chairs groaned under a crowd of sunburned locals, farmers, retirees, parents, all drawn by the promise of Ron DeSantis, Florida's steely governor, whose crisp suit and sharper words filled the room with an electric hum. The space, usually a backdrop for bingo nights and potlucks, felt transformed, almost sacred, under the weight of his presence. His voice sliced through the murmurs, steady and commanding, as he touted VY Toria schools, jobs, freedom, his hands slashing the air like a conductor of a well-rehearsed symphony. But in the third row, a tiny figure sat apart, a quiet ember glowing amid the sea of nodding heads. 7-year-old Emma perched on the edge of her chair, her blonde pigtails swaying as she clutched a faded red backpack to her chest. Her sneakers dangled an inch above the floor, her rocket t-shirt a bright splash of color against the muted tones around her. Beside her, her father, a wiry man with a Marlins cap shadowing his tired eyes, kept his gaze fixed ahead, his calloused hands twisting nervously in his lap. Inside Emma's backpack was no toy or snack, but a crumpled notebook, its pages a battlefield of purple marker scribbleless questions she'd scratched out during restless nights, fueled by a fear she couldn't shake. "You don't have to ask him," her father had whispered as they'd left their trailer that evening, his voice rough with doubt. "He's the governor, Em." But Emma's hazel eyes had flashed with a resolve beyond her years. "I do," she'd said, her small fist tightening around the straps. DeSantis rolled through his speech education reforms, parental rights, keeping Florida free, his smirk sparking polite claps and scattered nods. The crowd was tame, more curious than fired up, a far cry from the roaring rallies of his past. Emma watched him, her stillness uncanny for a child her age, her fingers tracing the frayed edges of her backpack like a prayer. She wasn't here for fun or a photo op. 2 months ago, a lockdown drill at school had left her trembling under a desk, the teacher's hush, "Stay quiet," echoing in her ears long after the all clear. That night, she'd overheard her parents arguing, her mom's tears, her dad's helpless, "What can we do?" And a question had rooted itself in her soul, growing thorns she couldn't ignore. As the floor opened for questions, hands shot UPA, farmer griping about irrigation, a retiree fussing over taxes. DeSantis fired back with crisp answers, his confidence a polished shield. Emma waited, her heart hammering, her father's sidelong glances heavy with worry. "You sure?" he mouthed, but she shook her head, sliding off her seat with a soft thud. The crowd barely noticed at first as she shuffled to the microphone, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. Then heads turned, whispers hissed, "Who's that kid? What's she got there?" As she stood, dwarfed by the stand, her backpack a shield against the stairs. The moderator hesitated, but Emma's raised hand demanded her turn. When it came, the room hushed, a fragile silence settling like dust. DeSantis leaned forward, his sharp eyes softening just a touch, a flicker of amusement curling his lips. "Hey there, young lady," he said, his voice smooth, almost playful. "What's on your mind?" Emma unzipped her backpack, pulling out her notebook with trembling hands. She flipped to a page marked with a star, took a shaky breath, and looked up, her voice small but piercing. "Governor DeSantis, you say you're keeping us safe, but why do I still hide under my desk at school?" The words hit like a gunshot, raw and unyielding, shattering the room's calm. DeSantis's smirk vanished, his jaw twitching as his eyes locked on hers. The crowd gasped, a collective inhale that sucked the air dry. For a man built on control, that moment stripped him bare, his face a map of shock, unease, and something deeper, something he couldn't hide. The silence after Emma's question was a Leave VY thing, thick and suffocating, coiling around the Ocala crowd like a storm about to break. DeSantis stood rooted behind the podium, his fingers flexing against the wood, his polished facade splintering under the weight of a 7-year-old's truth. His eyes flicked to the audience, searching, maybe for an escape, then back to Emma, who held her notebook like a sword, its purple scrawl a silent accusation. The room's hum died, every cough and shuffle swallowed by the void. This wasn't a reporter's trap or a rival's jab, it was a child's plea, and its simplicity cut deeper than any debate ever could. Emma didn't flinch. Her sneakers stayed planted, her hazel eyes unblinking, daring him to answer. Her father sank lower in his seat, the brim of his cap a shield against the stares now boring into them both. Whispers erupted, "She's right. You know, what's he going to say?" until the moderator waved them down, her clipboard shaking in her grip. DeSantis cleared his throat, a harsh rasp that sliced the quiet, and straightened his tie stall, a lifeline. "That's a tough one," he said, his voice quieter, stripped of its usual steel. The crowd leaned forward, sensing a shift, a crack in the armor of a man who rarely faltered. He took a breath, his chest heaving under his suit, and met Emma's gaze again. "When I was a kid," he started, his tone softer, almost distant. "I grew up in Dunedin, played baseball, rode my bike till dark. School wasn't a place you fear it was just there. But you're right, things have changed." His words trailed off, and for a heartbeat, he wasn't the governor, just a man staring into a past that didn't match the present. Emma tilted her head, her pigtails swaying, her silence a demand for more. "I've got 3 kids," he continued, his voice steadying but raw. "Mason, Madison, Mamie. They're little 4, 6, 2, and every time I kiss them goodbye, I think this is why I fight. But hearing you, maybe fighting's not enough." The room quivered, his admission a stone dropped into deep water. A woman in a denim jacket clutched her chest, her eyes glistening. A man in a camo hat nodded, his weathered face tight with something like recognition. Emma's father looked up, his cap tilting back, a tear catching the light. DeSantis pressed on, his voice firming as he slipped into familiar ground. "We've got more cops in schools, stricter laws, training everything I can throw at it." "I'm not stopping." But the words rang thin, a politician's reflex drowned by the vulnerability he'd let slip. Emma's brow creased, her small hands tightening on her notebook. She wasn't here for promises, she wanted truth. The moderator edged closer, ready to call time, but DeSantis raised a hand, stopping her cold. He stepped from the podium, his shoes clicking like gunfire in the stillness, and crouched before Emma, his sharp edges blurring. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice a whisper now. "Emma," she said, steady, strong. He nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "Emma, you're braver than most adults I know." A ripple of soft claps broke out, but it faded fast, the air thickening again. "Last year," he said, his throat tightening, Madison, 6-year-old, woke up screaming from a nightmare. She'd heard about a shooting on the news. I held her, told her I'd fix it. But she just kept asking, "What if you can't?" His voice cracked, and he looked away, blinking hard. I didn't have an answer then. I still don't. The crowd gasped a raw, jagged sound. Emma's eyes softened, but she didn't waver. "My dad says she's not just rules," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "It's when you're not afraid to sleep." DeSantis rocked back, his face crumpling a flash of a father, not a governor before he stood, turning to the crowd. "She's right," he said, louder, broken. "I've been building walls, but if kids like Emma are still scared, I've failed them." The room erupted gasps, sobs, a wave of disbelief, and in that moment, Emma's question became a mirror, reflecting a truth too long ignored. The Ocala Community Center trembled with a new energy, a wildfire sparked by Emma's words and fanned by DeSantis' unraveling. The governor stood exposed, his suit wrinkled, his hands flexing as if grasping for control he'd lost. Emma held her ground, her rocket t-shirt a beacon in the dim light, her notebook a testament to a courage that had flipped the night upside down. The crowd was no longer a passive mass, ears streaked faces, hands clasped, eyes burned with a mix of shock and awakening. Her question, "Why do I still hide?" had torn through the room, and DeSantis' broken, "I've failed," lit the match. He wiped his brow, stepping back to the podium, but the shield it once offered was gone. "I don't have kids hiding under desks in my Florida," He'd said 100 times on the campaign trail, a line that once drew cheers. Now haunted him, etched in the lines of his face-tight jaw, furrowed brow, eyes shadowed with a doubt he couldn't mask. He looked at Emma, then the crowd, his voice low but fierce. "I've got a job to do, and I've been doing it wrong. Not because we haven't tried, but because we haven't listened really listened-to kids like her." The words landed like thunder, and the room shook with its sobs from a mother in the back, a choked damn right from the camo hat man, a swell of murmurs that refused to fade. Emma's father leapt up, pulling her close, his cap tumbling to the floor as he buried his face in her hair. "You did it, Em," he whispered, his voice breaking. She nodded, her small hand patting his back, but her eyes stayed on DeSantis, wide and glistening. He crouched again, reaching out, and this time she took his hand-tiny fingers in his callous palm, a bridge no one saw coming. "You've got a fire in you, Emma," he said, his voice thick with something like awe. "Don't ever let it go out." She smiled, faint but real, and whispered, "My mom says fear's okay if you fight it." He froze, her words a dagger and a lifeline, then stood, turning to the crowd with a fire of his own. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice rising, raw and unscripted. "It's about all of us. We've got kids dreaming under desks instead of stars because we're too busy arguing to fix it. Emma's not afraid to ask, so why are we?" The room exploded applause, shouts, feet stomping the floor, not for a politician, but for a moment that cracked the world open. A woman in a denim jacket stood, tears streaming, clapping until her hands reddened. The farmer from earlier wiped his eyes, muttering, "She's just a kid, but she's right." Strangers hugged. Voices overlapped. "We've got to do better. This is on us." And Emma stood with her dad, 7-year-old spark, now aflame. DeSantis raised a hand, quieting the storm, his face a battlefield of resolve and ruin. "I'm going back to Tallahassee tomorrow," he said, his voice steady but shaking with purpose. "Not to sign more laws, but to sit with kids like Emma, parents like you, and figure this out together. Safe's not a speech. It's a promise we've got to keep." The crowd roared, a tidal wave of sound claps, cheers, sobs lifting the roof. Emma's father hoisted her onto his shoulders, her rocket t-shirt soaring as she waved her notebook like a flag. Around them, people stood, linked by a shared ache and a fragile hope, their applause a vow to fight. As DeSantis stepped back, his shoulders slumped but his eyes alight, the room buzzed with a new truth. A child had undone a giant, not with anger, but with a question too honest to dodge. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice nearly lost in the din, "for waking us up." She nodded, her pigtails bouncing, and whispered to her dad, "Mom would have been proud." He hugged her tighter, tears falling free. The lights dimmed, but the energy didn't. People lingered, talking, planning, changed. Emma's question echoed beyond the walls, a call to action for a nation watching. If a 7-year-old could demand more, so could we all. And DeSantis's face shattered, then rebuilt, told the story. Some battles start with a child's voice, and they're the ones worth winning.